All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Tara Moore, and I'm the Director of Conservation Partnerships for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. I'm so happy you all joined us tonight for this webinar. It'll be about the Wildlife Services Division, which I am so excited to hear about. They work with the endangered species and the invasive species and so many more tasks that I know they will cover. So thank you, Steve and Willie, for being here. And I'm just going to go over a few things before we get started. We're going to go ahead and mute all of our lines. So if you haven't muted your own line, you can go ahead and do that now. If you are unable to find that, I can also go ahead and do that for you after I'm done here. We will have some polls at some point during the presentation. This is a cool new feature. So polls will be, if you look at your screen and you look at the top right corner, there are three shapes. There's a triangle, there's a square, and there's a circle. And the poll will be right up there. So when a poll question is ready, Steve or Willie will say that there's going to be a poll question coming, and you can click on that dot up there and answer the poll question. And that will be a fun, interactive way to kind of see what you're all thinking. So we're excited to see that. If you guys have any questions and you want to ask a question to Steve or Willie, you can put that in the chat box, which looks like that little kind of blurb symbol at the top right-hand corner. So you are free to put questions in there at any point. We will ask them either during a break or at that moment if it's relevant to that particular slide. And I am going to turn it over to John Kinsella, who is the Vice President of the South Wake Conservationists chapter. And thank you all for joining so much.
Yes, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I think you're really in for a treat. And our president of our chapter, Chad Chandler, was not able to make it tonight. But he did want me to just tell you a little bit about our chapter, South Wake Conservationists. Obviously, by virtue of the name, we're located in Wake County. Our mission statement says protecting wildlife and their habitat through conservation programs and public outreach. And you can see this on our website on Facebook. Some of the things we're involved in. Recently, we're pretty heavily involved in the Trees for Trash program. We planted about 130 trees in 2 locations, including a elementary school in Fuquay-Varina that has an environmental education program, and also at the art park in Raleigh. We're also involved in developing pollinator gardens. We have people involved in working on what's called the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. And we actually have a member who was able to get the mayor of Holly Springs to commit to helping monarch butterflies. One of the most important things we have that is not only a conservation area, but also a humanitarian area, is called Farmer and Communities Managed Deer Program. And we have a couple, Guy and Judy Gardner, who are very heavily involved in that. And essentially, they have the machinery to take deer that were brought in by hunters and process that, and then sent out to the homeless and people in need. And right now, there's a tremendous need for protein in these difficult times. So what I want to do now is move on and introduce our first speaker, Willie Harris. Willie has a long, distinguished career working for the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which is located inside the Department of Agriculture. And then Wildlife Services is located inside, the Animal and Health Protection Service, which, is known as APHIS. Willie spent 19 years working for our Plant Protection Division. And their main, mission is to prevent the entry into the United States of, harmful pests, disease, different situations where we've actually had, plant pests and diseases come into the United States, like citrus canker or emerald ash borer, resulting, in millions and millions of dollars, in damages. Willie also, when he worked for Plant Protection and Quarantine, he was located in some pretty diverse areas. He worked at JFK Airport in New York. He worked in Miami, which are probably maybe the two busiest airports in the country as far as, importation. He worked in Orlando, Florida, and he was a state plant health director in Puerto Rico. Willie, after leaving PPQ, he then, worked with me in our Investigative and Enforcement division. And then for the last several years, he's been the regional director, Eastern Regional Director of Wildlife Services, essentially in charge of the programs in about half the United States. So Willie's also a member of, the Senior Executive Service. You don't get any higher in government than that. So Willie, turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks for that introduction. And also thanks for talking about the venison that's being donated. Because this year marks Wildlife Service. We donated over a ton of venison meat to organizations to feed the hungry. So that's something I wanted to mention as you mentioned that earlier today. But thanks again for that great introduction. I'd like to get started by just talking about the organizations in APHIS. Steve, do you have the PowerPoint up at this time? Great. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, as I get started, I'm going to just go over APHIS, and I'd like to provide you with the information about Wildlife Services history as we go through the organization. But I think it's important for you to know about APHIS, which is the agency of which Wildlife Services falls under within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Wildlife Services is not an agency. A lot of people tend to call us an agency, but we're not. But we're programmed within the agency, and that agency is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. Now, I may switch back and forth saying Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services, or I may say APHIS, which is the acronym. We in government tend to use acronyms, so when I use acronyms, I'm going to try to catch myself and let you know exactly what I'm talking about. But we've got John on here and we got Steve on here, so if I forget, please remind me to flush those things out. But APHIS has a mission to protect the health and value of American agriculture and natural resources. And there are 7 operational programs under APHIS with missions that tie directly into the overall APHIS mission. Next slide. The first one is the Animal Care Program in APHIS. It's a regulatory program that enforces the Animal Welfare Act and Horse Protection Act. It determines and promotes the standards of humane care and treatment of animals through inspection and educational efforts. It's a regulatory program that regulates the industry under these laws: the Animal Welfare Act and the Horse Protection Act. And these are the industries that they regulate: the animal exhibitors. These would be your zoos, your dealers, dog dealers, breeders, transporters, research facilities. And these research facilities can include universities that do research on animals. And within the horse protection arena, they regulate the Tennessee walking horse industry and racking horse industry. Next slide. International Services has foreign service professionals located at various posts overseas to help facilitate international trade related to agriculture, in which International Services provides international animal and plant health expertise to safeguard American agricultural health, promoting U.S. agricultural trade. So these are foreign service officers spread throughout the world. Next slide.
Oh, it looks like we just have someone who's accidentally presenting. Karavila, if you wouldn't mind just clicking that stop sharing button right in the middle of the screen. Awesome. Thank you so much.
The one next to the X, the little square.
Great. And if you guys just want to go back into the presentation, Steve and Willie. Thanks.
Okay, you should be on the biotech slide. Okay, the biotech program is another program in APHIS.
I'm not seeing the slide yet.
Yeah.
Are you guys all seeing the slide?
Yeah.
Go back.
Okay. If you just want to. Thanks, Steve. Sorry about that.
Are you not seeing it? It's showing it on my side that is presenting.
I'm not seeing it. Oh, perfect.
There it
There
is.
it is.
It's awesome.
There it is. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Okay, the biotech program regulates the industry by protecting agricultural and natural resources and ensuring safe development of genetically engineered organisms using a science-based regulatory framework. Oh, lost it again. Hey, Steve, it disappeared again.
Oh, I can still see it.
Yeah, it's still up there. We see it.
It's good on this end.
Yeah, I'm not
Lost it
sure.
on my side.
Willie, if you click on the participants thing in the top right-hand corner, it shows like 31. You can click in there and the presentation should be an option. It'll be Steve Smith presentation, and you can click on that and you can pin it to your screen. Let me know if that helps.
So, where's that again?
So if you look in the top
What
right,
is that again?
yeah, sorry. If you look in the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's a little person figure, and it says 31 next to it. If you click on that, and then you can scroll down to Steve Smith presentation, and you can click on those three dots and then pin to screen. His presentation should stay up. Let me know if that's working.
I see USDA in blue, white and blue.
That's all the way at the top.
Yep, that's on the top of the presentation screen. So that should be Steve's slide. But you're not seeing the rest of the slide
No, I'm not.
with APHIS on it? Okay.
But let's try something else. Steve, as long as everyone else can see it, I can use some papers here. Okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Willie. If you have the presentation on your screen also, you could also pull it up there and we could kind of continue to see it on our end as you go through it, and you can tell us when to go to the next slide if that will work for you.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
1 second.
Thanks, Willie, and thanks everyone for being patient. Tech issues are always a little bit frustrating, but we will push through it.
All right, let's go. The Biotechnology Regulatory Services Program regulates the industry by protecting agricultural and natural resources and ensuring safe development of genetically engineered organisms using a science-based regulatory framework while enforcing the Plant Protection Act and agricultural Bioterrorism Act. Next slide.
Veterinary services.
Vet services protects and improves the health, quality, and marketability of our nation's animal products, and veterinary biologics by preventing, controlling, and or eliminating animal diseases and monitoring and promoting animal health and productivity. They regulate the industry under multiple laws related to agriculture. And these are the laws. Next slide. The Plant Protection and Quarantine Program, or PPQ. This is where I spent my first 19 years in USDA. It safeguards agriculture and natural resources from risk associated with the entry, establishment, or spread of plant pests and noxious weeds. The program regulates agriculture under the Plant Protection Act, Federal Seed Act, Endangered Species Act, Honeybee Act, Agricultural Bioterrorism Act. But as you can see, a lot of these are somewhat overlapping. It's important to note that in 2002, the program, the Plant Protection and Quarantine Program under APHIS, transferred about 3,200 employees in full-time positions over to a new organization that was being created in the federal government. And that organization was the Department of Homeland Security. During that time in 2002, those employees were pulled together along with parts of immigration and customs inspectors to create what we now know as Customs and Border Protection. So these employees were port workers. That's where I spent my first 19 years, as I said before, as an inspector and as a canine officer with the agency's Beagle Brigade. Next slide. The other program that's very important to these regulatory programs I just mentioned is the Investigative Enforcement Services. This program supports the other regulatory programs, as I mentioned, by directing and coordinating investigations related to APHIS regulatory program statutes and regulations, while coordinating enforcement of the laws and regulations with the Office of General Counsel, and in some cases, the Department of Justice. This was where I spent my last 9 years before joining Wildlife Services in 2018. And it is where John Kinsella, it was John Kinsella's last stop before he retired in 2011 as the regional director. Next slide. Now, Wildlife Services, this is getting into Wildlife Services, provides leadership to resolve wildlife conflicts and creates a balance allowing people and wildlife to peacefully coexist. Wildlife Services works to protect agriculture, wildlife, other natural resources, property, and human health and safety. Unlike the other programs I mentioned, Wildlife Services is not a regulatory program. Funding from the other programs mostly comes from our federal appropriations. However, Wildlife Services receives its funding from cooperative service agreements. We do receive some appropriations for some programs like oral rabies vaccination to control the spread of rabies in wildlife. And we do receive some for feral swine as well to reduce those populations across the landscape. But most of our funding for our operational needs comes from cooperative service agreements. Next slide. Now I'm going to get into the history of Wildlife Services, and then I'll have a couple of slides on this, and then we'll get into the good stuff with Steve Smith. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services has been around since 1970, but Wildlife Services has been around since 1886, with its beginnings as the Division of Economic Ornithology and Mammalogy, as the Animal Damage Control Program within USDA. Now, in 1905, the program was placed under a section called Biological Survey. At that time in 1905, the program partnered with the USDA's Forest Service to investigate the predatory livestock problems farmers were experiencing across the country.
Good spring migration.
In 1913, the program began doing rodent work. So these are the beginnings of the program. In 1915, 9 districts were formed in the western states, followed by appointing predatory animal inspectors. This is now where we're starting to beef up staff to do some work out there in the field. And in 1916, rabies work begins with the rise of rabies found in coyotes in states like Northern California, Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada. By 1922, predator and rodent control programs spread into Arkansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Indiana, Louisiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Washington State. In 1925, the titles for predatory animal inspectors that I just mentioned changed to state leaders. So this may have been where our state directors were starting to formulate. Within wildlife services, each state across the country just about. Steve Smith is the state director for North Carolina. We have a state director in Alabama, Georgia, California, and so on and so forth.
They lose their open water.
Next slide.
So the peak is typically through October. From October through about, I have December on here.
In 1929, there was yet another name change.
February or March.
This is something you can always count on for the federal government. You can count on name changes, and you can count on reorganization. So in 1929, we had a name change. It was changed to the Division of Predatory Animal and Rodent Control. And in 1931, the National Animal Damage Control Act was created. Now, this act gave the division legal authority to conduct animal damage control work and to enter into cooperative agreements with state governments and local entities. If you can recall a few slides ago, I said we do get some appropriations, but a lot of our work comes from cooperative agreements. These agreements are where the states, local state governments, counties, cities, local entities, including businesses and airports, they will provide us funding to hire people, to buy equipment, and to do work that they requested based on these agreements. In 1939, the program was transferred from the USDA to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is another organization, another department. You have the USDA and you have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is under the U.S. Department of Interior. The program then was called the Bureau of Biological Surveys Division and Predatory Animal and Rodent Control. Then in 1965, this is where we're starting to really formulate into wildlife services. The name changed again to the Division of Wildlife Services, but it remained within the U.S. Department of Interior. It wasn't until 1985 that the Division of Wildlife Services Animal Damage Control was transferred back to USDA and placed under APHIS, where we now are, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. And then in later years, we dropped the division, we dropped the animal control, damage control in the title, and we're now known as Wildlife Services. At this point, I'm going to turn this discussion over to North Carolina State Director Steve Smith, and he will give you the nuts and bolts of what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. Steve?
Okay, thanks, Willie. Tara, were there any questions that popped up for Willie before I move into my portion?
We don't have any questions yet. Nope, we are all good so far.
I had posted a question.
Oh,
There's one in the chat.
Monty, I am so sorry. Yes, we have a question. What standards are used to ensure and enforce humane treatment of agricultural animals? In particular, a spotlight has been given in recent years to shocking mass horticulture conditions, particularly for chickens and pigs. Who sets the rules?
Can you ask that question one more time, please?
Sure. What standards are used to ensure and enforce humane treatment of agricultural animals? In particular, a spotlight has been given in recent years to shocking mass horticulture conditions, particularly for chickens and pigs. Who sets the rules?
Well, that's a question I really can't answer. I don't believe APHIS sets the rules for that because it's more so in the realm of food safety inspection services, I believe. If you can recall, I talked about the animal care program, and they talked about animal welfare activities related to a lot of the industry governing exhibitors, governing research facilities, transporters, and things like that. So a lot of that is pretty much out of our realm dealing with the food side. So it's USDA's Food Safety Inspection Services, I believe, that deals with that.
Thanks, Willie. And John also has a question, I believe.
Any questions on that? Pretty interesting stuff.
John Kinsella, do you have a question? Sorry, you have your hand raised. Awesome.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that under the Federal Animal Welfare Act, from the very beginning, they excluded farm animals. So, like chickens that we see in slaughterhouses, pigs, those are, excluded, from the Animal Welfare Act. So a lot of times it depends on like local humane societies or humane organizations to, discover or to report, really horrific conditions.
So when you're talking about, I'll go ahead and just do it verbally, if you don't mind. So when you're talking about, ensuring that they're treated appropriately in research facilities and places like that, you're talking about wild animals, not domesticated animals or agricultural animals?
Yeah, you're talking about the animals that were, exempted from the Federal Animal Welfare Act were farm animals and laboratory rats and mice. Wild rats and mice, wild species, those are covered. But farm animals are not covered. Birds were covered by statute, but they were never covered by regulation. So, the agency felt like they just did not have the manpower to, cover mammals and birds.
Thanks.
We do have another hand raised from Unknown. I'm not sure who Unknown is, but if you do want to unmute yourself, you are able to ask the question out loud. I'll just give them a second. To unmute, you can scroll your cursor over the bottom of the screen and click the microphone button.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Hey, John. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. This is all so technical for such an old person. I'm just curious about the last statement from John over there. It sounds like CAFUs in large animal production factories have a free ride outside of any parameters for your organizations, and that's interesting because if they're food animals, agricultural animals, and something isn't going right there, then the food quality is going to suffer, and so is the health of the people that consume those items. So I don't know how that happened, how that got excluded out of that group. It sounds like kind of a political thing.
A lot of those situations are political. There's a federal statute called the 72-hour law, which means that if somebody transports domestic horses for 72 hours or more, they have to stop periodically and let the horses out, to graze and do things like that. But it's a very obscure law, and I don't think it's really enforced very much.
Do you regulate the hogs? Like hog collar?
That's vet service.
All right, I think we're all good with questions for now. Thank you. So you can move forward, Steve.
Excellent. Appreciate you having us. It's an honor to be here and giving this presentation to your group. When John first forwarded the email, actually maybe Willie forwarded it to me from John, and I looked at the first email that was sent, and they talked about the time block that was set aside. I'm thinking, wow, an hour, that's a lot to talk about there, and a lot of big time frame to fill. And then after some back and forth, John sent a list of topics he'd like for us to talk. And I'm looking at this list of topics. I'm like, I need like an hour and a half to cover all that. That's a bunch, but we'll do our best. I don't know if I got to everything on John's list, but I talked about a lot of the big ones. And so what we'll do is we're going to go through, and I had this presentation broken up in a number of different segments. And so we're going to go through, typically I think it's about 2 topics. And after every 2 topics, we'll have a little break in case anyone has any questions about the topics we just discussed. But if there's something that you see, real time, and you want to throw a question into the chat or raise a hand or whatever, Tara said she'd be happy to interrupt me, and we'll answer questions as we go. But do know that I've got breaks kind of factored into this presentation so we can have questions all along the way. So we're going to kick it off with actually the first survey for everyone to look at. So we're going to go to this slide right here, and Tara, if you can put up the first survey question.
I just launched it, so you guys should see a little dot in the top corner with those shapes. So hopefully you're all seeing that.
Am I the only one not seeing it? I don't see it.
You are not
Top
the only
right.
one seeing it because we only have a few votes so far. So thank you for that.
What are we voting on?
You click on poll.
Yes, if you click on polls, so if you go to the top right-hand corner of the screen, there are those little shapes, and there's a little dot that should pop up, and there's a poll question in there. What animal caused the damage to this soybean field? And the options are deer, feral swine, beaver, or groundhog. If you guys want to keep that thought in your mind, if you're not able to find the poll answer here, and we'll just give it another second. We are getting in some votes now. Feral swine is getting a lot of votes. Deer has a few votes. Groundhog has 1 vote. So we'll give you just another second. But keep your answer in your head, and Steve will share the answer in just a sec. Yep, more for feral swine. That seems to be the consensus, Steve.
Okay. That's definitely a good guess on this. But believe it or not, did we get any votes for beaver? Because this is beaver damage that you're looking at right
Wow.
here. So I think, can you see my cursor on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, this is actually a pretty considerable cut from this soybean field. It's kind of hard to get a gauge of the scale in this image. But what you don't see is over here in the woods to the side, there's a stream that runs along this field. And just right about here, there is just a beaten path. I mean, it's as close to a wild sidewalk as you could have come. And beaver were coming in and out of that stream up into this soybean field. And they'll nip off these soybean plants right at the base, at the ground level. And they were dragging them back to that stream. And just over time, they were working this field and kept growing it bigger and bigger and bigger. Taking out a pretty substantial chunk out of this field. But this is going to lead into this first segment that I'm going to talk about are essentially the top 2 species that we get requests for assistance for in North Carolina. Beaver being number 1. And typically, for us, a lot of the calls for for assistance involve infrastructure, but there's also agriculture and some other resources that are always impacted by beaver. And as you can see in this image here, this is a common complaint that we see. Beaver will build dams right next to highways and back water up, and this will start impacting the shoulder of the road, and as well as the infrastructure here in the side road bed. You can kind of see there's a dam right here snaking through. Kind of hard to see, but then there's also dams downstream that are holding all this water in place. Now in North Carolina, we have a program, the Beaver Management Assistance Program, and it's comprised of 4 entities that contribute to this program. The Wildlife Resource Commission, Department of Transportation, us, we bring some to the table as well, and then individual counties all kind of chip into this large pot to provide assistance for beavers in North Carolina, any kind of beaver complaints. And typically, you know, when it comes to highways and roads, you know, something like this is the type of damage we often see. You know, once that dam is established, whether it's in a pipe or a tile or just downstream of the road, water backs up. This is the type of thing that can happen. And we're going to give you a much more dramatic example of what can happen when the drainage structure under a highway is completely plugged and you have a very large rain event. So we're going to play a video here. Now this video is kind of long, so I'm just going to skip through a few segments and not play the entire thing. Hopefully it'll look okay on your end. And this video came from somewhere in the New England area, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, somewhere up there. It was, if I'm not mistaken, it was filmed by a highway department employee who was called out to this site because of the water on the road. And so at a certain point, he started filming, you know, what was taking place here. You see, when the water cannot get through the drainage structure under the road, eventually it's going to start eating away around that drainage structure. There's the end result.
How long did that take?
The whole length of that video was about just under 5 minutes. And, you know, but right here, this is skipped ahead, probably either late that same day or the next day to get to this point here. But really, you're probably looking at, you know, 12 hours or so, start to finish.
Wow.
So in addition to just damage incurred at the road, you know, there is a public safety issue that can come into play. And this is an event that actually occurred recently here in North Carolina, where we had a location that active beaver dammed up the drainage. And we had a heavy rain event, and this caused water to go across the road, as you see here. And a car, it was after dark, so they're driving along. They can't see the water on the road. They hit the water hydroplane and skidded off the side into the field here beside the highway. Thankfully, no one was injured. Obviously, it could have been a lot worse, but this is a common issue we see. Beaver are absolutely incredible. You know, regardless of of the the impacts they can have on a lot of different resources. They are amazing animals, and when you think that a rodent that weighs 30 to 40 pounds, can build dams and structures like this, it's really pretty amazing. And they're a keystone species. I mean, they're one of the few species that has a true impact on their habitat. They create their own habitat, and it's just absolutely fascinating. And they have an impact on a lot of other species. Now, not just dams, like we see here out in the middle of, not necessarily the middle of nowhere, but it's common to see large dams like this in highway infrastructure places like this is a 8 or 9 foot concrete tile, and that's not uncommon for us to see dams built all the way to the top, and they'll completely plug these things. Now, for us to remove a dam like this, we have a couple extra tools at our disposal. We've got folks out there in waders and rakes, and they'll rake out dams to open things up once beaver are managed at the area. But we also have the ability to utilize binary explosives to remove beaver dams. And this is some drone footage we shot recently here in North Carolina. And this makes for an extremely efficient way to remove large dams and get water flowing again. Okay, so this is going to be another dam that we removed with explosives, and we're going to play at full speed first, so you can show just how fast this works.
Has caused some micro.
So actually, this is the slow-mo version. Let me go back a slide. Skipped ahead. There we go. Let's try this.
Habitat can't build up those fat reserves and thus just die off because they can't make it. So just kind of put that in perspective. I just think when I saw that kind of equivalency.
This particular dam here was located very close to a highway, so we have a road that's just out of view of the camera, and we also have some power lines that are right up above the highway. And so because of that, we delayed this shot. So we have trained explosive specialists that can use explosives in very tight quarters or close to structures, near highways, under power lines and utilities. And typically what we do, instead of just loading up a dam with a bunch of explosives, setting it off and throwing a bunch of stuff in the air, we can kind of control our shots and delay charges. So this actually was a double shot. And what you see here, this was an electric detonator coming here, and then it hooks up to 2 delay detonators. So when this thing fires, you're going to see one detonator light up, and then the second detonator light up, and there's actually 2 sets of charges. We have the charges here on the front of the dam, and then a charge back here in the back. So you'll see this one go first, and then the second one will go shortly thereafter. In the slow-mo version, you can really see it.
Especially you get up to New England, upper Midwest, they're primarily both insects, worms, as you know, fruits.
And by delaying charges like that, it allows us, as I said, to remove dams in very close quarters. We keep what's called the fly rock. Fly rock is basically everything you throw into the air. And we can kind of help reduce that, keep it to a minimum. And also, we're able to shoot dams. That dam you saw earlier under the highway in that box culvert, we can go in and remove that with explosives. We can place a few charges in there, delay them so only one charge goes off at a time, and you use the water, the pressure of that water to kind of push through and really open that dam up. So just seeing here some of the results of what we've done, before and after working these sites. Again, agriculture is also another resource that's impacted. This is an agricultural field that was completely flooded. We went in and removed the dams. And this is going to be a side-by-side drone video before and after. So on the left, you see the area where we removed the dam, where it's flooded, impacting a cornfield, as well as some other resources. And then on the right is after the shot the next day, after the water has has been removed and flowed out, restored that creek to its original flow. And that's always our goal when we blast a dam with explosives or even remove a dam with brakes. Our goal is to remove that dam and return that stream to its original width and depth. I mean, we're not looking at just blowing a big hole out there. We want to try and return that stream to where it looked like prior to that dam being constructed.
Brushy areas, again, brushy scrub areas, wetlands, certainly.
All right, so let me back up. We get to that one. Let's put up our next poll question, if we could, Tara.
Again, April and departs August, September.
Okay, it is launched. Let's see if we have more participants. The question is, after beavers, what species accounts for the most calls for assistance in North Carolina? And the options are feral swine, deer, vultures, bats, or geese. We have some votes coming in. Geese is getting the most votes so far.
Understandable.
Geese are getting all the votes so far. I should say. Oh, got some feral swine, some bats, some deer, some more geese. All right, so we have the most votes for geese, and then the next common one is feral swine, and then we have deer following that.
All right. Well, once again, we've stumped everyone. Let's watch this news article. This news story ran just a couple months ago here in North Carolina.
Buzzards. Wow.
So Steve, if you just want to give us what's going on here, unfortunately we can't hear the volume, but if you just want to give us kind of play-by-play on what they are saying. I think we're kind of getting it though.
Yeah, it's just discussing the vulture issue that this one particular family is incurring in Franklin County. You're kind of just seeing what can become of a vulture roost or loafing site. This is very common. I mean, this is not an uncommon thing. This is something we get calls for on a regular basis, in fact, daily. And it's not, uncommon to see. But one thing we don't know about vultures is why they choose particular loafing areas. And so there's two kinds of habitat types for vultures when they primarily, group up like this or flock up. We've got roost sites, and those are locations where vultures will spend the night, and a lot of times you'll see this on water towers, cell phone towers, large trees. And that's, once those birds sit down, vultures are not real keen at flying at night. They want to be on a roost site, and that's where they spend the night. And then in addition to roost sites, we also have what's called loafing areas, and that's what you were seeing here on this home, and we see this very often. And, haven't really come up with a real good rhyme or reason of why vultures choose certain loafing areas, but it's one thing we do know is, especially in the winter months, they prefer to have an area that gets great morning sun. And I don't know if any of you have been driving around or ever seen a vulture, wings out. It's just sitting on a perch. It's got its wings spread out. It's absorbing that sun. It's warming up in that sunlight. So that's something you'll see often, especially in the real colder months, in a loafing area for vultures. But one thing about there's something, and when you see something like this, where again, this is a loafing area all over a playground that's completely whitewashed. Not something you want your kid playing on. I mean, that's not a healthy situation. And they're really interesting birds. I mean, vultures are absolutely fascinating. I've heard some amazing stories through the years, and why they choose to do certain things and pick at certain things is really fascinating. As you can see right here, this is also a very common complaint that we see. The birds will get onto vehicles. They'll pick at windshield wipers. They'll pick at the weather rubber weather lining around windows and windshields. They'll peel that off, not to mention the damage that the talons are doing to your paint job. On homes, they'll pick at shingles and pull those up. I mean, that's a common thing. And, they're not really consuming any of this. We've done some stomach content studies, and none of this is showing up, in their stomachs. But they just pick things apart. Inflatable pools, foam seats on lawnmowers, we've seen them just torn to shreds by these birds. I mean, it's something. I had one call from an individual, and she was talking about, hey, all of a sudden 200 birds started showing up. They're all over our house. They're in our yard. They're on our porch. And this was right around Halloween. So they had some Halloween decorations up on the porch. And she told me, she's like, we had a bunch of these little pumpkins, as, decor on our porch. And she said, I looked out this morning and the vultures were rolling up our pumpkins all around the yard. I mean, it's just, like I said, they're really fascinating birds. Obviously, they are what they are. They're vultures, and they kind of get that reputation of just being that. But they're one of the most unique and interesting species of birds that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. But one thing we found is actually very successful in dealing with these types of issues is the artificial effigy. And what this is we'll take the wings and tail fan of a real bird, whether it's a roadkill or we have a permit to take a few birds in some of these sites, and then we'll adhere these wings and tail fan to the body of a duck body from a taxidermy mold and put a turkey head on the bottom, spray paint the thing black. And there's one thing, vultures are not real fans of seeing their own dead. So if you hang up this effigy in a very visible location where there's a loafing area or roosting site, a lot of times those birds will disperse in a matter of a day. And we've seen results like that where this effigy would go up and one day later, birds are gone. So this is something that is quite successful. In some areas we've seen, 70, 80% success rate. Some areas it's a little more difficult. It varies from location to location. But the vulture effigy and intense harassment. We use pyrotechnics to scare the birds off if they're in an area that we can utilize that tool. But effigies work great. And that's something we recommend and deploy a lot, not just in North Carolina, but all throughout the Southeast.
Steve, we have two questions, if you don't mind, for a sec.
Perfect. That's my first break.
Awesome. Actually, we have three questions now. Has the vulture population increased? If so, why? There was an upward trend of the vulture population, both turkey and black vultures. It's not a real steep increase, but we have seen a slight tick upwards. Nothing to be overly concerned with. But it seems like the number of calls we're getting and the complaints that we're getting from these birds are increasing, and it's not an equal trend line. I think our number of calls has gone up more so than what we think the population has increased. And it's hard to get a real grasp of populations. Because the only thing we have to go with are like Christmas bird counts and those types of surveys, and so that's kind of what we're utilizing. There's really no other decent surveys, especially as it relates to vultures. As far as why they're increasing, they're just a very successful bird. They don't have really any predators to speak of, and it's something that if you've seen these things in action, they're very adaptive, and they're just really, really successful. Their nesting success, it's not a heavy nesting success. With black vultures, it's usually 1 to 2 eggs per clutch, and it's in most cases where we've seen that it's 100% survival. It's rare to have one of those birds lost. They're very good at their parental care, and it's really neat seeing these birds. I mean, a baby vulture right before it fledges, it looks like a little gray fluffy chicken. They're actually kind of cute if you can imagine that from a vulture. But in any case, they are successful at what they do. Great. Thanks, Steve. We have a habitat fragmentation question. Are they losing open natural space due to human development?
Always is a consideration. Anytime you see additional conflicts with the public, that always comes into play, and it always can be a factor. One thing about black vultures is they really like to nest in like rock outcroppings. And so, when we see habitat fragmentation that impacts that type of habitat, obviously that's going to impact your nesting opportunities for those birds. But yeah, at the same time, like I said, we haven't seen impacts to the population as a whole. But the fragmentation probably has more of a play into the number of impacts with just people. Great,
thanks. Is the term buzzard appropriate to this bird?
Yeah, that's a common one thrown around. You won't hear the term used a whole lot in the wildlife biology field. Its the proper name is vulture. In fact, I got onto that topic years ago, and I did some really extensive research, and I couldn't find an official name of any vulture worldwide that actually went by buzzard. It's kind of just like just that generic term that encompasses all vultures. It's kind of like seagull. You hear the term seagull thrown around a lot, but there's not a species called seagull. There's a lot of ringbill gull, all your gull species. So it's just a common term that encompasses all vultures, but there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's fine.
Great. Did you say that the vultures aggregate for their migration?
We've seen some interesting results from some of our studies that we've done with vultures. We have done some tagging and telemetry studies with vultures. And what's really unique about them is you would think that a roost site would be comprised of a group of birds, and that group would kind of move around site to site, go to loafing areas together. And we've actually seen that vultures will move from roost site to roost site, sometimes even nightly, and there's not really a consistent group that hangs together. So yeah, even though they group together for these loafing areas and at roost sites, they're kind of their own bird. I mean, once they disperse, they'll kind of still do their own thing. And it's not like a true flock of birds that you would think of that they move together and hang together.
Great, thanks. We do have two hands raised, but we do have a beaver question that we didn't get to. What happens to the beavers when the dam is blown up?
So typically for us, a beaver is considered a nuisance species in the Southeast and in most states in the Southeast. So when we have to go in and remove the dams and address the flooding issues, we have to remove the beavers as well. So the beavers are removed through trapping. So they're removed typically before we remove those dams. So we do most of our trapping efforts ahead of time. And once we feel like we've removed the problem beaver from that area, that's when we'll remove those dams.
Okay, and John Crystal, I think you would like to ask a question, and you are muted, so you'll just have to unmute your line.
Okay.
You're
Can
good.
you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, this goes back to the beaver, but first, I'm a fan of vultures, just like Ben Franklin wanted it to be our national bird. It does a service. Of course, I don't have them roosting on my house. That might be different. But going back to beavers, I was raised thinking that, that beavers and beaver spawn provide a very positive environment for many, many, many other species. And I was wondering whether that's any kind of consideration before you blow up a beaver pond.
Absolutely. It's when we go in and address a beaver-related issue, it's something that's impacting a resource of some type, whether it's agriculture, property, or infrastructure, highways, that kind of thing. And what we do is we typically only take care of the issue that's impacting that particular resource. If you look at some of the watersheds that our folks get into, it's got beavers for miles up through a lot of these watersheds. And we're not going to go through there and remove beavers from these massive lengths of watershed. We're going to address the problem situation at hand right there impacting that particular resource, and then we're moving on. And we're going to see a lot of repeat locations. So we may go in and remove some beavers, remove a dam that's impacting a highway, and then we're going to go on and deal with our other things. Now, more than likely, 6 months, a year down the road, could be 2 years, beavers are going to return. And so we're going to have to address that issue again. And what's interesting about beavers is if you go into a site and say there's a pair of beavers there, you remove those beavers, remove the dam. A year later, more beavers come in. More often than not, they will build that dam in that exact same location that the beavers previously did a year ago. And that's something I've always found very interesting, that there's something about the topography of these areas where these beavers hone in on, and they know exactly where's the most advantageous location to construct their dam. But no, we're not out there looking to eliminate all beaver created habitat. We just want to protect the resources that we're being called.
Thanks.
Yep.
That's all for the questions for right now, Steve.
All right. So let's go into our next topic here, which is a big one. I know a lot of folks like this answer on one of the questions. And so, this is a big one for us in the Southeast. And I'm going to talk about two of our national programs. And Willie had mentioned these two programs in his portion of the presentation. The first one we're going to be is the feral swine program. And a lot of you know feral swine, invasive species, and arguably probably the most destructive invasive species we have in North America. And we all know the crops, that's something they have a big impact on. And a lot of times, we're utilizing drones to document this kind of damage from the sky. If you look at it, if that's a mature cornfield, the producer has no idea the extent of the damage inside that cornfield. If you're down there on the side of that corn, you're talking about corn that's 7 to 9 feet tall. Unless they walk through the middle of that cornfield, they have no idea that there's this massive section in there that these swine have gotten in and destroyed. And one thing that's kind of been interesting about pigs, there's been this kind of belief that in mature cornfields, they think they live in there all day, especially in irrigated corn. In irrigated corn where they have water, obviously they're surrounded by food. A lot of folks think those pigs never leave that field. And I mean, they have no reason to. Everything they have the cover, and they'll stay right there. And that's something we've kind of played around with going into some of these cornfields to see if we can locate, pigs, middle of the day, just hanging out in these fields. So in addition to agricultural damage, property damage, another major concern for us is the disease risk and the disease impacts. Seeing feral swine interact with domestic livestock is a very real concern. There are a number of diseases that feral swine carry and can transmit to not just domestic pigs, but also domestic cattle as well. Obviously, we've seen the damage that they can do through the rooting. And if you've got a very nice manicured lawn and you step out to enjoy your morning coffee, and this is what you see in your backyard, it's going to be a bad day, and this is something that can occur overnight. I mean, a sounder of pigs can move in and do this kind of damage in one night easily. A golf course superintendent rolls up and sees this on his nice tee box. Again, very upset. And all too often, we see pig issues like this in urban settings. And a lot of times we'll have to go in and we'll set a trap up to catch the pig while they're at that location doing that damage. But it's more than just property. It's more than just agriculture. Feral swine have an impact on our natural resources as well. They do compete with native species for food. Deer and turkey are our big ones. But it's more than just the food competition thing. There was a recent study we did in Texas, and we measured the impact of feral swine on turkey nesting success. I don't know if you can see there, the left image, that is a hen turkey going into her nesting site. And then 4 days later, in comes a feral swine and destroys that nest. In this particular study, they documented 25% nest loss to feral swine on the turkey nests they were monitoring. Another area or habitat that you may not presume that pigs would show up is on the beach. And this is a common call for us, and an issue that we deal with is these beach pigs and island pigs. And these pigs are a real concern to a number of threatened and endangered species, as well as sensitive habitats. This is a pig that was removed from the beach on Cumberland Island in Georgia, and the biologist that removed this pig, he cut open the stomachs just to see what was inside, and this is what he found. I don't know if you can see very well in this picture, but that is a bunch of baby sea turtles that he found in the stomach of that particular pig. One thing that we know contributed to the expansion of pigs was very interesting, demonstrated in what you're going to see here in this slide. So Tennessee kind of tracked the progress of pigs in their state. And going back to 1950, there really wasn't any pigs in Tennessee to speak of. Now, if we fast forward, two groups of pigs kind of showed up in two parts of the state. Now, let's go from 1950 all the way up to almost 2000. And you see, those two areas, those populations of pigs, they grew some, didn't grow a great deal, but there was some expansion. Now, where this star stopped just shy of 2000, that's when hunting was made legal. They were classified as a game animal in Tennessee. So granted, we went, almost 50 years, and you saw the expansion. Hunting is now made legal in Tennessee, and now we're going to fast forward just 10 years. And you see what happens. Pigs spread all across the landscape. So, I mean, we know pigs are moved around a lot. Folks will go out, they'll hunt them, they'll capture them alive, they'll throw them in a trailer, they'll move them down the road for possible hunting opportunities at a different location. And this is perfectly exemplified in Tennessee. It was shortly after this that Tennessee decided to make the management decision to ban hunting of feral swine. They no longer recognized it as a game animal. And I mean, you could still shoot pigs on your property, but there was no hunting season. They turned it into a true nuisance species, and that's a step they chose to make to implement more intense management operations to reduce the number of pigs. Now, for the longest time, we were just opportunistically taking pigs with Wildlife Services for disease surveillance issues. However, in 2014, our feral swine program was established, and we were allocated over $20 million for feral swine issues. And to distribute those funds throughout the states of the U.S., every state was ranked. It was given a level, and it was based on pig density. And so if you look at the dark brown states here in this slide, those are our level 5 states. Those are the states with the highest number of pigs. North Carolina is a level 4 state. So that determines our baseline funding that we receive in North Carolina to deal with feral swine. Now, when it comes to feral swine control and philosophy of addressing these animals, whole sounder trapping is our go-to. That's our bread and butter. When we enter a property that we know feral swine are present, our goal is to get every single one of those pigs on that property. We don't want to capture half. We don't want to, get a few and educate a bunch and chase others off. We want to get every single animal. That's always our goal. It's very similar. I heard this thrown out from an individual in the field, and he said, it's comparable to when you have a roach problem in your house. You don't want an exterminator to come in and kill half the roaches and leave the other half. You want all of them eliminated. And feral swine, we look at them the same way. I mean, they are a very destructive, invasive species, and we want to remove them completely from the landscape. So, I mean, in addition to large traps that capture the entire sounder, we also have aircraft at our disposal, and we do aerial removals in certain areas. A lot of, for the many years, it was thought that, aerial gunning is only really applicable in the West with open habitats. But, in recent years, we found this can be a very successful and very efficient method of removing feral swine. you know, it really just comes down to, regardless of the habitat, if you can see the pig, you can remove the pig. And so we do aerial gunning in North Carolina as well as throughout the Southeast, and it proves to be a very efficient and effective method for removing swine. So our next national program I want to talk about is our rabies program. And what you see here in this map is the different strains of rabies that we have in the United States. We're going to be primarily focused on the raccoon strain of rabies in the green. And the raccoon strain of rabies was established years ago in Florida, and it got bumped up, kind of similar to the swine thing in Tennessee, you know, moving pigs around. A lot of raccoons were trapped in Florida and taken up to Virginia and West Virginia and stocked and released for hunting purposes years ago, a long time ago. And so that actually spread the raccoon strain of rabies in that part of the country. And then from there, it gradually spread north-south. The two, you know, Florida and Virginia came together and met, and it spread up to the north as well. And research has shown that the spread rate of rabies would be about 25 miles annually. So if we did nothing about this strain of rabies, we potentially could see that raccoon strain, you know, in 50 years, all the way out into the western states. So our goal with our rabies program was essentially to stop that westward spread. And how to do that? So, you know, for us, it was we wanted to establish a barrier by.
I sent a copy of this presentation to Brianna, so.
You know, these are vaccinated baits that the raccoons will eat and essentially become vaccinated for rabies. And once you have that barrier, you can kind of see there, that's, you know, there's going to be some intermingling. It hopefully should stop that spread. And those are the two main goals for our National Rabies Management Program, is to prevent the spread. Pie in the sky, future goal, hopefully we would like to eliminate the raccoon rabies variant. And so if you look here, this is showing essentially a 30-year plan that we've got for elimination of the raccoon strain of rabies. And we want to eventually start, you know, marching that barrier eastward, and then also kind of rolling around and start pushing south towards Florida. You know, it's a massive goal. Can we do it? We hope so. But you know, that's what we're kind of moving towards. But we have successfully stopped the westward spread. I mean, the raccoon strain is very stable right now. This is a look at what we've done here this year as it relates to raccoon strain rabies. In addition to, down in Texas, they're dropping baits. You can look down here. This is for actually canine strain rabies, not the raccoon variant. But this barrier here is where we drop baits to stop that westward march. An idea in North Carolina, we dropped over 275,000 baits in western North Carolina. So this is the area where we're dropping baits here in North Carolina. One thing to point out too, this little green box here is a research project where we're testing a different level of VRG plus. And so it's basically just a more potent vaccine bait. And so we've got a naive population up here that we're dropping these baits just to see if this bait could be more successful for us moving forward. So our strategies for getting these baits out, primarily it's fixed wing aircraft baiting. We have these fixed wing airplanes that are going to fly transits. These transits are 75 meters apart, and they're constantly dropping a steady drop of baits out the bottom of the plane. We also do helicopter baiting as well as hand baiting in more urban areas where we can't fly fixed wings over and drop baits, you know, over buildings and houses and pelt people on the ground. So in those more urban areas, we'll do hand baiting by vehicle, but also we can do cluster baiting in helicopters. So we'll fly over a town, and if we identify a nice cluster habitat in the middle, let's say what's a park or a stream, we can go over there with the helicopter and just throw down a bunch of baits and zoom off, and we're going again. We also have been experimenting with some bait stations as well. So we'll have these in certain areas where we can put baits in these stations, and the raccoons will come up and just take out what they need. So looking at some numbers here, this is what we put out. I mean, total baits distributed, almost 9 million baits, 7 million with fixed wing, and 1 million with helicopter. And as you can see, our ground baiting operations have actually decreased quite a bit through the years because we're doing more and more with the helicopter. We found that's more efficient. It's kind of hard to believe. You would think a helicopter would be very expensive, which it is. It does cost a lot of money to run a helicopter. But when we were looking at the areas we were covering with multiple teams in vehicles driving all over the place, and the fuel we're burning up and the time, helicopter just made a lot more efficient sense. And so we're doing more and more with the helicopter baiting. In addition to...
I think we do have some questions, Steve. I'm sorry to break in there.
Yeah.
So can these swine that are killed be processed for food similar to FCMD, the deer program?
Right,
the donation program that we mentioned.
Yeah, actually, so we cannot do that. We actually have a policy that prohibits us from donating swine meat to charities. And we do it with deer. I mean, any deer we move, we do donate to charity. Reason for that is the disease concern. We are removing swine that are positive for pseudorabies and swine brucellosis. So because of that, we cannot legally donate that swine meat because of that disease risk. It's a liability issue. We can't have someone contracting brucellosis from meat that we've donated.
Great, thank you. Another question: do other animals eat the rabies bait, or just the raccoons?
Yeah, sure. We get other animals that will consume these baits. Possums, skunks. In fact, skunks are one of our target species. Skunks are one of those species that can carry the raccoon variant, but also there is the skunk variant of rabies. So absolutely, other animals eat it. Foxes will routinely pick up the baits, and it's beneficial to all species. We always have a number on all the baits. So if someone finds these baits in their yard or whatever, and we've had calls of, hey, my dog came up with this bait in his mouth. I got it out of his mouth. I'm worried. There's no harm, and actually there's benefit there, even though most domestic animals hopefully are already vaccinated from rabies. But other species can be vaccinated from the baits as well.
Thank you. That is great to know. And John Crystal, I think, has his hand raised. If you want to unmute and ask a question, John.
If the swine contain, some items that you don't want to pass along on the food chain, what about the deer that are donated? Is there any testing done for wasting disease or any of those kind of things with the deer donated to food banks and whatnot?
Yeah, so we do typically sample the deer we remove for chronic wasting disease, at least a small sample, and that's really to assist the state. Every state has a goal number of samples they want to get for chronic wasting disease. And so we will sample some of the deer we remove to help them get to their goal numbers. One thing with chronic wasting disease, though, we donate it to food banks or other charities that are aware of that. And the risk to, human consumption of the meat is really 0 to none for CWD. And there's no other disease risk that we're worried about for white-tailed deer that would impact any kind of charitable donation.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I think that's it for the questions for now.
Okay, great.
Oh, sorry. We do have another hand raised. Frank?
Yeah, I was just curious, when the food source of an animal increases, that often leads to a population increase. Have you found that with the raccoons?
That's a question I can't intelligibly answer, and you're right. Typically, if the food is present, it will positively impact reproduction. One thing we do see, though, is, and it's a harmful thing, is congregation around large food sources. And so if you have a source of food out there that is considerable, we will see raccoon numbers increase around that food source, which is not a good thing. So that's, especially for disease transmission risk there. But as far as does it, contribute to an increased reproductive rate or success of that animal, I can't say for certain. It probably has a positive impact, but at the same time, you could have an increase in disease, lethal impact from the disease itself if there's some disease spread. So, it could come out in the wash. Is that the last one, Tara? I'll take that as a yes. So in addition to the dropping of baits, we do what's called advanced surveillance activities. So all the dots you see on this map represent a raccoon that was sampled, whether it was a roadkill raccoon or it was turned in to us from a animal health department. And so, all the greens are rabies negative, where our reds are rabies positives. And so it kind of tracks, you see it kind of tracks along that barrier that we have established. And, we will get rabies positives within our barrier, and we're not overly concerned about that. It's when we get a rabies positive out here outside of our barrier that really causes us a little bit of concern. And typically we have contingency efforts that we'll put into place and bait extra areas around that to help address that concern. So just giving a kind of a rundown of our rabies accomplishments through the years. The canine strain of rabies has not been found in the U.S. since 2004, and the CDC declared the U.S. canine rabies free in 2007. There's also a fox strain of rabies that has not been found since 2013 in Texas. So that's also, a great thing. Again, we've stopped that spread of raccoon rabies to the west, and we're also doing some broad trials of a new bait that is proven to be extremely successful and could help us kind of obtain that goal of elimination, raccoon strain elimination in the U.S. So this is definitely, it's one of the largest, if not the largest, coordinated wildlife disease program in North America.
We do have one question, Steve.
Sure.
From Monty, if you just want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry, just real quick. I wanted to make sure I understood. You have created this western boundary to prevent the westward migration, but I think you've answered it, but I want to make sure I understood. How are you addressing everything to the east? It's like,
yeah. The short answer is we're not. So everything to the east, we recognize that part of the country, it's endemic. Rabies is endemic, and we're not concerned with that right now. It's kind of like, think of it this way: if you have a large dining room table and you spill a massive jug of milk, the best way to clean up that is to come in from the edges, right, and kind of clean that mess from the edges in. Versus you wouldn't take a single paper towel and throw it right in the middle of that big massive pile of or puddle of milk. So we don't really do anything to the east, with some exceptions, I should say. We have done some rabies management in isolated areas like Cape Cod, as well as Manhattan, Central Park in Manhattan, New York. There was some rabies outbreaks there, and we've gone in, and actually we were doing, instead of baiting, we were doing trap and vaccinate release programs there. So that's a couple of examples where we have done some rabies addressing issues in the east. But for the most part, our goal is to stop the spread. Once we've stopped that, start pushing it back east, and hopefully, eventually eliminate it.
Very good, thanks.
Yeah. Anything else? All right.
Nope, that's all we have.
So this was a topic that was suggested by John, and it's our efforts on airports. And so, obviously this event right here brought a lot of attention to the impacts that wildlife can have on aircraft and the flying public. I mean, even prior to this, we were doing a lot of work on airports to protect the public and to protect aircraft. But, this one really brought to the attention. It caused a lot of extra funding to be thrown at the issue. And it's a very serious concern. And we have employees all over the country stationed at airports doing this work. Here in North Carolina, we easily have about 10 to 12 employees that are full-time on airfields addressing wildlife issues. Now, birds are obviously a big concern. That's what you always hear about. In fact, if you hear there's a popular acronym when it comes to airports and wildlife called BASH, B-A-S-H. It's Bird Aircraft Strike Hazard. And really, it's a more accurate term to call it a wildlife aircraft strike hazard, because in addition to birds, I mean, and they are a real concern, we encounter a lot of different wildlife species on airports. Coyotes are a big one, and they'll stroll out right onto the runway as aircraft are coming and going. It's not uncommon. Why do the deer go under the fence? Well, you know, if you look at the picture taken right before this, it's kind of obvious why he went under that fence. And you know, and so deer on airfields are a major concern. That's a very large animal, and when an airplane impacts a deer, it causes a lot of damage to that aircraft. You know, you can imagine deer down here are one thing, but you know, at the airport, up at airports in Alaska, they've got much bigger ungulates that they have to deal with, which is a scary situation to think about, having something that size on an airfield. And I don't know if any of you caught it recently, or how, you know, some of you may be into some of these shows like this, but there's a new show called Ice Runway, Ice Airport, Alaska, something like that. I think it's on the Weather Channel or something like that. But it basically documents the inner workings of the Anchorage Airport, and they feature our biologist there at the airport in a number of segments, and all of the things he does on that airport to protect aircraft. But in addition to mammals and birds, it's not uncommon for us to deal with other species as well. I mean, this here was a 9-foot alligator we removed from an Air Force base in Georgia. I mean, anything could come out onto an airfield and really cause some concern. Now, when you have a strike to an airplane, you know, it can be very minor, or it can be very sincere and cause, you know, that aircraft to go down. You know, taking a bird through a windshield of a jet can be a very traumatic experience, if, you know, assuming that they're able to get that aircraft back on the ground. So, and, you know, one of the things we do dealing with these kinds of impacts, these bird strikes, if you will, is we do collect the samples from these strikes, and we'll send this DNA analysis. Actually, it's called SNARG. There's your word for the evening, SNARG. That's what basically what he's cleaning off this airplane to send up. He'll bag it and send this up to the Smithsonian Institute. There's a bird lab in the Smithsonian Institute, and they'll do DNA analysis if they have blood. They can even work with feathers. If all you get is feathers, they have hundreds and thousands of species on hand to do feather comparisons, and they can narrow it down and determine the species of bird that impacted that aircraft. Now, in addition to collecting bird strike information, I mean, we're out there actively addressing wildlife concerns. In this case, this biologist is firing off pyrotechnics to chase birds off. And in addition to the just active control, you know, we do a lot of habitat impacts, whether it's bird spikes on structures around the airport to keep birds from perching on those, or even, you know, real habitat management on the airfield itself. We have recommendations for mowing schedules to, you know, grass height between, you know, 9 and 11 inches is ideal. What you want to avoid is these seed heads. You know, those seed heads are going to be very attractive to a lot of different species. So we will do a lot of habitat work to kind of avoid this type of situation. Now, in addition to just scaring birds off and habitat management, we obviously will do direct control. And one thing we've done a lot here in North Carolina, as well as other states, is we've done a lot of raptor relocation. So when we have a raptor on an airfield that's not responding to pyrotechnics, that's not chasing off, it's staying in the area, we do have specific traps that we utilize to trap these birds. And we will ban the birds and move them. You know, ideally we'd like to go at least 100 miles away if we can, if we have suitable habitat for that. And I should have ran a report to see, but we've already moved over 40 different raptors in North Carolina just this year, and that's something we've done quite a bit of. You may recall a few years ago about the big influx of the eruption, if you will, of snowy owls that came way south, and we were seeing snowy owls on a lot of airports that previously were never. I mean, they weren't even in state, and they were showing up on airfields. Snowy owls really were drawn to that habitat. You think about typical snowy owl habitat; it's these large meadows, and when when these birds are coming down south, and we don't have those large meadows like they're used to, an airfield is a very attractive habitat, and they're going to be drawn into that. So we ended up trapping and tagging and moving quite a few snowy owls from airport habitats throughout the eastern U.S. Now, it's not just raptors and owls that will move around. If we've got to go out there and get a turtle off the airfield, so be it. We'll do that and move that guy, away from the airport operations area and hopefully from being impacted from an aircraft. Now, I want to share here in North Carolina, one thing we were seeing a lot of was turkeys right next to runways on airfields, and turkey's a very large bird, and that's something that an impact with an aircraft would be quite detrimental. So we worked with a lot of different entities, and there was a lot of communication involved back and forth, and we set up a relationship with Texas, North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, and the National Wild Turkey Federation. And so on several different airports in North Carolina, we rocket netted turkeys. We processed these birds, worked them up. We sampled them. We drew blood because they have to be sampled for some certain diseases before they can be released. Boxed them up, took them to the airport, and they got a first-class flight down to Texas, where they were part of a restocking effort down there, reintroducing these birds into historic habitat in Texas where there were no longer turkeys present. So this has been a very successful program. We're entering our third year of doing this. And this past year, we sent a total of 65 birds to Texas. So I've got another break here after our airport segment. Are there any questions on that?
I don't see any questions yet, unless someone has a question and they want to unmute and ask it. All right, I think we're good to go, Steve.
All right, so one topic that John said that he wanted to hear about was brown tree snake. And the brown tree snake was a species that was introduced to the island of Guam. And here's a kind of a graph. You can kind of see they came into a harbor on a harbor ship back in the late 1940s. And through the years, spread out through the entire island of Guam. So they were completely covering the island by 1970. And, you're talking about an island that had no snakes. So every species on this island had evolved with no serpent predators at all. So when you introduce a new predator to an island like that, especially something that's arboreal, like a brown tree snake, that's going to grossly impact the native species on that island. And this is a Guam rail, and this is just one of many bird species that were completely extirpated from the island of Guam. Thankfully, we still have Guam rails in captivity in zoos, so there's a breeding program to hopefully restock those in the future. But they were completely wiped out on the island along with a number of other bird species. Now, in addition to just the impacts of the native species on the island, you had an infrastructure on an island that had no snakes. So you weren't prepared for all of a sudden having these influx of snakes. And, when they stretch out across an electrical outlet, they're going to fry things. So as these snakes, expanded through the years, the outages across the island greatly increased. Now, I don't know about you, but when it's time for me to go take care of business, that's the last thing I want to see. And, so this was a very scary situation. This snake is a venomous snake, but it's very mild venom, and it's a rear fang snake. So, it really wasn't a huge human health concern. It's one of those species. It's kind of like a coral snake that we have here, where the snake would have to bite your pinky and really chew on you to really envenomate you. And even then, it's not a real highly toxic venom, but still, nonetheless, I don't want that underneath me. And, you know, on the island, there are a few natural predators, like Nile monitor lizards, but they were not having an impact on this species of snake. So when we first got involved with the brown tree snake on Guam, our initial goals were containment. And so we had traps set out, and we made barriers, you know, to keep the snake from getting onto airport property and getting into cargo and other aircraft that were leaving the island, because the last thing we wanted was this snake spreading over to Hawaii. And so initially it was 100% containment. Let's keep this snake from spreading any further than it has. We trained canines to sniff out snakes. So we were doing inspections of cargo. We were doing inspections of aircraft themselves, and we would find snakes, you know, that would crawl up into the aircraft. And these dogs would even, you know, locate snakes that were in vehicles. So once we felt like we had a good containment program established, the next part, or next phase, I should say, is, okay, can we address the snakes on the island? Is there a way we can save this island, get it back to, you know, a snake-free, you know, grand scheme or high goal for that? And so we started batting around ideas, and this is where our research unit comes into play. We have a research wing of our agency, and we work very closely with those. And one thing we found is acetaminophen is extremely toxic to snakes. So, you know, we wanted to find a way to get this out into the population and distribute this over the island to address, you know, the snake population. We know snakes love mice, but one thing that was a challenging part, this is a tree snake. It's an arboreal animal, so it's up in the trees. You know, how can we? Banksy made a painting somewhere that mirrored our idea of dropping, you know, mice with parachutes to get them hung up in the trees for these snakes to consume. And we had a lot of different ideas about how to do that. And yes, that is a McDonald's French fry container here. So, I mean, that was just one idea was thrown out. And our first real initial go at it was a streamer type of device. So we had these streamers on pieces of cardboard, and we glued the mouse to one side of the cardboard, and we flew transits and tossed these things out of helicopters. Now, over the years, we've evolved this program and gotten much more efficient. So the looks of it now is more like this. We have the mice, as you can see there, that is acetaminophen glued to the belly of the mouse. And they're loaded up into these little carriers. And then we actually have an automated machine now that we can load into the helicopter. And so when we fly our transits along, this automated machine will just spit out, you know, these streamers at exact locations. And that allows us to get more accurate GPS coordinates of where all of these baits are falling, or I should say mice. These mice are falling. You know, ideally they get hung up in the trees and it opens up, and hopefully the snake will come along and consume those baits. Now, we are still doing other things. We still have traps set on the island. I mean, even as far as we add a little mechanical mouse to these traps, or even the traps are getting a little more higher tech. There's also some pheromones and scents that we'll put in there to attract the snakes into these traps. We're also doing a lot of trail camera monitoring to just keep an idea of what the snakes are doing and where they're spreading. We are seeing success. We are hopefully, you know, we continue with this downward trend of snake population on the island, but it's going to continue for some time to get this established. Now, one unfortunate bit of news that we did get 2 months ago, back in September, I think, was brown tree snakes were found on Cocos Island, just off the lower tip of Guam. And so that's a very unfortunate thing. It was reported by a fisherman that was out there around the island. He noticed a snake and reported it. We did immediately. I say we. It's a group effort. I mean, there's the Guam Island of Wildlife is also a part of this, and so they responded quickly to this. And hopefully we can get that contained before they get established on that island, because there are obviously species of animals out there that can be greatly impacted by an invasive predator like that. So I just got a few slides I want to talk about. We're talking about invasive species management. You got to talk about this guy a little bit. So everyone should know this is a nutria. And so I want to just touch on our nutria program in the Chesapeake Bay that has been extremely successful. The impacts from nutria in the bay are considerable. You know, when you look at this comparison, two photographs, they've decimated the marsh up there. And so we entered into a cooperative agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service to address nutria at the Delmarva Wildlife Refuge. And so this grew into a team. And at one point at the peak, we had as many as, I think, 12 or 13 full-time employees doing nutria control work in the Chesapeake Bay. And so over the years, from 2002 to 2011, over 13,000 nutria were removed from this area across 160,000 acres. The last nutria captured was back in 2015. We've been doing nothing but surveillance the last 5 years, and we have not found a nutria in the area. It's incredible, the success of this program. And when you look at an area like this, you know, pre-operations, and then fast forward 2 years after we've moved through the area, the regrowth and replenish of that marsh that we're seeing is really incredible. So that program has been a real feather in our cap for restoring that really sensitive habitat up there in the Chesapeake Bay.
Steve, we do have a question. Oh, that was perfect timing. Look at that. Yep. Frank, if you want to ask your question.
Yes. Have you done anything for nutria control in North Carolina, specifically at Hatteras? And I live on a small lake inside Raleigh, downtown Raleigh, and we have nutria on this lake. And I was just wondering if what sort of mitigation things have been done for North Carolina. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So we haven't done anything to the extent of Chesapeake. We do control nutria. In fact, we probably take 400 or 500 nutria a year throughout the eastern part of North Carolina. But we haven't done any focused, true nutria eradication, if you will. And honestly, and I attended a meeting last year. It was myself and a biologist with the Wildlife Resource Commission. We went up to Virginia and attended a meeting up there because they're starting to plan for the Chesapeake Bay project, because it's done. I mean, there hasn't been a nutria up there in over 5 years. So they want to move the funds from that program to another area. And one area they're looking at is southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. Up in that area, there's a couple of refuges up there right near the state line. And they're looking at possibly moving the program to that part of the country to, again, you know, see if we can have the same kind of success there that we had at the Chesapeake. No decisions have been made yet. So it's still, we're kind of in a wait and see mode. But honestly, the biologist with the Resource Commission, our fur bearer biologist, you know, she said they're kind of established in North Carolina, and really the number of complaints and things coming in is not that substantial. And we're not really seeing the gross impacts. Now there could be a reason for that, in that they've been in North Carolina so long that they're now, you know, established, and, you know, probably 50, 60 years ago, we maybe saw some, you know, impacts from these animals, but now the impacts are made, and it's like, no, okay, you know, they're not really a greasy wheel, or I mean, a squeaky wheel, if you will. But yeah, to answer your question, we are doing some control in certain areas, but nothing large scale like up there.
John Crystal, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it was just an observation. I talked to somebody in wildlife over at Mesquite, and I said that usually every time I go out there, I see a nutria or 2 or 3 or 4, and over the last couple of years, it's seldom that I see any. And I asked him why, and he said, well, because now with global warming, we have alligators in the area, and alligators seem to like them a lot. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I will say that we have done some I don't know if we did anything last year, but year before we had a cooperative agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service, and we did do some control, nutrient control at that refuge. So that helped as well.
Steve, I have a quick question actually. What do you do with the nutria bodies? Are they able to be fed to another species, or?
Right now, we don't do anything with them just because of the expense involved. So for us to try and so I'm glad that's a good question, because there are places that will pay for things like that to feed, for example, alligator farms. There are a lot of alligator farms that will utilize that for a food source, and so, or other zoos. And we have contributed wildlife, like we've done some with deer, we've done some with geese in areas where we have to lethally remove geese or deer. We have contributed those to different big cat zoos and sanctuaries and to utilize in those. But we haven't done anything with the nutria. And so for us to do something on a scale to make it worthwhile, we would have to invest in a lot of large freezers throughout the state, because we have a lot of employees that are capturing these things. And then to orchestrate the logistics of getting those full freezers of nutria, to the location for them to be donated. It's something I've looked into. I'm not going to lie. When I was stationed in Myrtle Beach for a long time. I don't know if anyone's been to Myrtle Beach and the big park there, Alligator Adventure. I was talking to someone there years ago, and they said that they truck in or ship in nutria from Louisiana to feed those alligators. And so why can't we take advantage of something like that? And it's just, we do it with some species, but just right now we just haven't done it with it.
Yeah, thanks. That's super interesting. I would love to talk some more about that after. But Frank does have another question.
Yep.
Yes, I was aware of the nutria down in at Hatteras that a local gun club brought in, I guess back in the 20s. But I was not aware of any nutria being in Raleigh. Is this anything you've ever heard of? I've never seen any other place than in our backyard.
I'm trying to think. So we are doing a project with the Wildlife Resource Commission, and what up? Let me try and I've got a map somewhere of all of our nutria captures. But we do have a couple. When I say a couple, I mean, I think maybe 2. So yeah, they are steady spreading west and north. In fact, there's a big concern, in Virginia. They're hoping to keep things kind of, or what's the, look at my map here. But there's a concern that they could get into Virginia, actually over through one of the major lakes to the east, like to the east of Roanoke Rapids. Not just coming up through the coast. So, I mean, that is a concern over on that part of the state. So yeah, they are moving that way.
John Crystal?
Yes, I heard they taste just like chicken and they're free range, and the people in Central America and Mexico love them to death. So,
Absolutely, yeah, that's. I had an opportunity to go to Cuba and work on a project down there where we were actually working on our military base, our naval base in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay, and we were controlling a similar sized rodent called a hutia, and you can look up that little rodent, and they were all over the base, on this base, and I mean, to give you an idea, I was there for 2 weeks, and over 2 weeks we removed over 1,200 of these animals, and this was a recurring thing. They were all over the place. I mean, you would crawl up under a mangrove tree and look up, and there'd just be like 15 or 20 hanging out because they would spend their days in this mangrove trees. But if you get off that base, that military base in natural Cuba, they were an endangered species because the Cubans ate them, and so they were not a problem off the base. So yeah, it's something to think about. If we could we could get folks on board with eating nutria, might help us with our issues.
I'm in for it. That sounds good. I think we're good for the questions for right now.
Okay. Yeah, let's cruise ahead. So one topic that John recommended we talk about for someone. Nope. Oh, okay. The cormorant issue, and this is something that's evolved quite a bit here the last few years. So cormorants can have a pretty substantial impact to the aquaculture industry. This is a large aquaculture facility in Alabama, and here's just another example of one in Mississippi. But not just aquaculture, large groups of cormorants can have a substantial impact on natural resources as well. I mean, this is an island here that they've taken over and roosted on, and as you can see, it's almost completely decimated of vegetation. And just to get an aerial view of a similar item, or an island in, this is down in a lake in Alabama, where it's kind of transitioning, in that same direction. You see all the whitewash on the vegetation below, all the vegetation on the trees are completely decimated. And so, historically, there was a what was called a depredation order issued by the Fish and Wildlife Service to control cormorants. And what that meant, there was actually two orders in place, one for aquaculture and one for natural resources. And so that meant anybody with an aquaculture facility or business, a commercial operation that was being negatively impacted by cormorants, they could lethally remove, as many birds as they needed to under this order without a permit. And so, that was the way things kind of were operating. We were providing some assistance to some of these facilities, as well as doing some work as far as natural resources. But for the most part, the industry owners were taking care of the problem themselves under these orders. Well, the Fish and Wildlife Service was sued 4 years ago, I guess, and they lost in court. And a judge vacated these depredation orders, stating that the Fish and Wildlife Service did not do their due diligence in their NEPA, or environmental analysis, of these orders. So when that occurred, that put some of these industries into a real frenzy. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service could still utilize the permit system for cormorants, but there were not permits being issued for the numbers of birds that historically were being taken. So we became much more involved in assisting these industries and different folks with cormorant issues. And so a lot of the things we're doing, especially in Mississippi and Alabama and some of these states with a lot of aquaculture facilities, is we're doing aerial surveys. And so we're flying surveys over these large tracts of lands, and we're documenting all of the roost sites, cormorant roost sites that could be negatively impacting aquaculture facilities. And we're identifying the roost sites that were in a certain proximity of aquaculture facilities. And then we're applying intense harassment of these roost sites. Once we identify where they are, we'll go out, locate them on the water, and just do intense harassment with pyrotechnics and lasers and other tools to disperse these birds and try and move them off to another part of the state, more so away from the aquaculture facilities, and hopefully reduce that impact that's occurring. Now, I mentioned earlier about our research arm, and we do have a research station in Starkville, Mississippi, and part of that research station's responsibility is aquaculture and doing research on the different methods and things that can be applied to help aquaculture facilities deal with all predatory birds, not just cormorants. And there's indoor aviaries, which you see in that last picture, and here we have outdoor ponds that we use at this research facility. And one thing we started doing is years ago, even prior to the orders being vacated, is doing telemetry studies on these cormorants. And so our research folks worked with our operations folks to go out and capture cormorants, attach telemetry backpacks to these birds, and trying to see where do they go, what areas are being impacted. So, like here's just a picture of a bird with a backpack transmitter. And one thing we were seeing, which is going to be a segue into kind of this next topic that I'm going to talk about, is these birds are are moving from the Great Lakes down to the southern states. And so a lot of these birds that we're dealing with on aquaculture facilities in the southeast were also being an issue up on the Great Lakes. You know, there's a lot of islands up there on the Great Lakes that were severely impacted, just like we saw in the one island in Alabama. We were seeing very similar things on the Great Lakes as well when the birds would go up there to winter. So that's going to segue into one thing that John wanted me to talk about is the Great Lakes Initiative, Restoration Initiative. And one thing you'll see here, all of these dots, this is a massive program. And all of the dots you see here on this map indicate a project, an individual project that's occurring as part of this massive initiative. So this is going to show you all of the federal agencies that are involved in this program. If you look here, you know, we down here, APHIS, are just one of many federal agencies that are involved in this project. As you can see, the number of projects we've received so far is 66, totaling over $13 million in funding for doing what we do. And also, if you look at this map, you'll see that it's not just the Great Lakes. It's the tributaries as well that are included in this initiative. So all the streams that feed the Great Lakes, and as you can see, it stretches into a lot of different areas. I mean, this is all the way down into Pennsylvania and even over into New York, this tributary. So projects are widespread and covering a lot of ground. Now, one thing I will say about this table here, 66 projects, this is just the projects that the funding came directly to us. We also worked additional projects through other agencies. For example, like the Fish and Wildlife Service, they're not set up to do direct control operations in the field for certain things. So the Fish and Wildlife Service or EPA, they may get funding to them and then turn around and pass those funds to us saying, look, we don't have the manpower or expertise to do this particular thing. Can you do that for us? So we actually have gotten more funding that's represented on this table here as a part of this massive initiative. And one thing about this is there are 5 primary focus areas of this initiative, and we operate in 3 of them. So we're primarily concerned with invasive species, non-point source pollution impacts, and then habitat and species. So this could be anything from, like I know we're doing work for feral swine up in this area that's a part of this initiative. We're also doing work for like mute swans and other invasive species. There's some beaver work. We're doing beaver work in some streams for protection of endangered trout habitat. In some streams up there, beavers will dam up the streams, and that can impact a native trout species. So we're going in and helping keeping those dams and those water flowing to help address that. And one thing here on this map you'll see, so how it's broken out by focus area. You look here, these are the 5 focused areas by color, and that's how the dots represent. One thing you'll see is not represented on this pie chart is these pink dots. There's a lot of these pink dots here, and that means there's multiple focus areas in those project areas. So in closing, I want to talk real quick. One thing they wanted me to discuss is our work with T&E species, especially over on the coast. And I'm going to focus on North Carolina. Right now, we have a full-time biologist that is out on the Outer Banks and does T&E species protection on all of the Park Service properties and refuges, as well as state-managed areas out there on the Outer Banks. And so there's, your big main species that you think about when it comes to predators and their threat to T&E species, and those species we are dealing with. The big ones, obviously, raccoon, coyotes, and feral cats are a big issue out there on the Outer Banks, and that's a species we address. One interesting note I wanted to discuss, though, is there's one species that has a significant impact to T&E species on the Outer Banks, and historically, we really have never done much with them, and that's ghost crabs. It's really surprising how many shorebird nests are destroyed by ghost crabs. And this is something we've really kind of come to light in the last several years, because for years, like there was some trail camera photos that were released out of Florida just a few years ago. I tried to dig them up and show them to you, and I couldn't find them. But it was a series of 4 photos that showed a ghost crab coming into a shorebird nest, eating the eggs, destroying the eggs, picking them apart, eating them, moving on, and then an hour or 2 later, up comes a coyote. Coyote comes up to the nest, sniffs around, maybe licks what's remaining, and then moves on. Had it not been for that trail camera there, the biologist would have come up, looked at that nest, saw the coyote tracks, assumed a coyote got this nest, let's blame the large predator. When in actuality, it was the ghost crab. And so that's one thing we're looking at doing in North Carolina. We're going to look at this coming year. Can we implement some management actions on ghost crabs to hopefully, have a benefit to T&E species? In addition to shorebirds, ghost crabs, they get a lot of sea turtles, young sea turtles that, hatch and are trying to make it to the ocean. Ghost crabs are on them. They take quite a few. And that's something else we're going to hopefully see if there's anything we can do to have a positive impact on that. So in closing, I just want to touch on kind of the urban stuff. When it comes to predators, we're seeing more and more urban calls for assistance. And it's coyotes are a big one. I don't know if you guys remember, this is a story from 2007 when the coyote, this is in Chicago, downtown Chicago, coyote went strolling into a Quiznos Subs and jumped into the drink container to cool off. It was a hot summer day. And so animal control had to come out and remove them from the cooler and turn them loose outside the city. But we're seeing more impacts from these urban settings. And, these are just a couple stories. I just went out and did a quick search. All of these stories here are from the last 2 months that I found incidents of coyote attacks in urban environments. And we're not immune to it here in North Carolina. In September, you may or may not have heard that 3 Marines and a sailor were attacked by coyotes on Camp Lejeune. And they contacted us for assistance. We sent in a couple of biologists, and we removed 4 coyotes from the area where these attacks occurred. And they've now opened up the area now for exercise. So there for a while, they were telling everybody, no jogging at night, stay away from these areas because they had 4 different attacks. In some parts of the country, it's not just coyotes. We have folks out in the western part of the country in certain states where, this is a call that they may get. And, looking out in your backyard and seeing a mountain lion kind of stroll through the area can be a little unnerving for some folks. But at the same time, it's not that, hey, a mountain lion showed up in my backyard. Can you come and get the thing? You know what? That's not always the case. Typically, we only get involved when there is an incident of concern. Is the mountain lion or any animal, coyote as well, is it not showing fear? Is it being too brazen? Is there an attack on a pet or a human? And that's typically when we tend to get involved. I've had many calls from concerned citizens. They'll call me up and say, hey, I just had a fox in my backyard. What should I do? I'm thinking, consider yourself lucky you got to see a fox. I mean, that's cool. And as long as there's no other concerns, you're not putting out food for it, it's not getting, whatever. We go through all those steps when we have someone on the phone. Be happy, you got to see some wildlife. But if you're really concerned, next time you see it, yell at it, throw something at it, scare it off. Instill that fear. You make sure that fear of people is still there, and that's what we want to avoid. So that's all I got.
This was super fascinating.
Cool.
I will let John, if he wants to say some closing words, chime in, but I learned so much. Thank you, Steve, Willie, John, everyone on the call for being members of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and for joining us on this super interesting talk tonight. You will get the recording hopefully in the next few days, so you'll be able to watch that again. I know there's probably some pockets of info that you'd like to pick out and hear again. So thank you so much. John, if you want to add anything.
Yes, I would. I want to thank Willie and Steve. It was an outstanding presentation. Steve, I wasn't sure, you were going to cover all the topics I had suggested, but you did. So I give you a great pat on the back for that. And Tara, thanks for, taking care of the technical things. And thank everybody for showing up. I hope it was very educational. I sure learned an awful lot tonight. So thank everybody.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having us.